Go home, party, have a
Go
good
home.
summer. Just
smoke weed.
take a break.
Gummies.
Take a break.
Gummies. It's summer. Do a little summer job, then and then when you go on a smoke break, get a little high on the smoke break. Like this is what you're supposed to do in the summer when you're 18.
I mean, I don't think everybody should take their life advice from Tim. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and this week we are checking in on young people again. It's been a suboptimal time to be a youth in America the last few years. This year's college graduates were robbed of their high school graduation, and now their college graduations are being marred by the chaos on campuses over the pro-Palestinian protests. We decided to talk to some graduating, progressive-leaning college seniors about the last few years and how they're feeling about campus politics and the future. My guest today is my buddy Tim Miller, host of the Bulwark podcast, and someone who hangs out with the youths because this spring he was a fellow at the University of Southern California Center for the Political Future, teaching said youths about how politics actually works. Tim, thanks for being here.
I thought that was going to be a gay bar joke. I do like to hang out with 20-somethings every once in a while, at the gay bar. But youths, it made me a little bit concerned about the fact that you were going to frame it as youths. I don't hang out with youths at the bar.
As I was reading it, I was like, this sounds like not great.
Is this a twink joke? Okay, is this a twink joke at Tim's expense? I was at the USC Center for the Political Future, and those were very bright youths, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah, I did a stint at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics last year, and also spent some time with young people. I gotta say, before we jump into this, because we were asking them specifically about COVID and sort of the years, like this cohort of graduating in 2024, they were seniors in high school in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And I did find myself feeling really badly for them.
Same. I mean, I had mixed views, but on this point, I felt very badly for them. I felt very badly at the time. I remember saying that at the time, I was like, being a senior in high school in 2020 would have been the worst. And I had such a meaningful, like, what is a more formative year in your life than the last semester of your senior year of high school and the first semester of college? And it's just like right. Literally all of my good friends were formed during that year. Like, the closeness of my high school friends, we really bonded, and then you meet new people. So like that sucked for them. That really did suck. Some of the other stuff, sometimes it's like the kids have never lived through a time with this much turmoil. And I'm like, okay, like, have you been, like, do we remember 1974? All right. Do we remember 1919? Like, other kids have gone through turmoil in the past, but on the COVID part, that really did suck for them.
So do you worry about this generation? Like, as you go around and talk to kids on college campuses, like, do you think, are the kids all right? Do you feel like, nah, these kids are fine? Yeah, like every generation has their stuff, but like they're okay.
I kind of land on that. And I felt this way about the group that we listened to. I don't want to totally overemphasize my USC experience because it was literally a self-selected group that were like, I want to go to a study group for the wayward Republican and be in his class. Right. So it was a type of student that shows that, right? And so like they're gonna, be more open to wanting to hear different points of view or be more moderate or whatever than somebody that's like, F those guys. And so, so maybe I'm a little more biased in that, but this group is the same. I mean, anytime I talk to somebody, the two kids that are in college, like the caricature that you see in the media, on the side of the fact that they can't handle disagreements and dispute. Like I don't see a lot of evidence of that. The phone stuff worries me, but I kind of wonder if I'm like Tipper Gore sometimes with the video games, because a lot of times when I speak to young people, like they're more, they're adapting to phone use and putting controls on it and being self-directed in a better way than like some old people I know with their phone addictions. Dude,
what I mean? Have I ever told you my like favorite thing I've ever read on the internet was somebody tweeted, like the internet has done to our parents what they said video games was going to do to us.
Right.
And it's like totally correct.
Yeah, I feel that way. So I have some. I think that there's some legitimate internet concerns. There are legitimate concerns when you listen to this group and any young people about where they're getting their information from. I've got worries about that. I've got worries about self-esteem stuff related to social media. But I think that a lot of this is a little bit overkill.
Yeah, they seemed. I mean, I liked this crew.
Me too.
They seemed like fine young people, and it did. I mean, we'll get into this more, but there was an element of feeling like what we see on the news right now about what's happening on college campuses is just so specific to a couple of places and sort of rife with conflict entrepreneurs. And it didn't feel like these kids, like they're just like such, only some of the kids actually had things going on their campus to begin with. And the ones that did sounded pretty benign. And they were all against violence and they all, so anyway,
their
we'll get
mindset
into
about it.
more.
I just look, and I've talked about this a bunch on the other podcasts, and so it's just worth stating as like where I come from on this. I totally agree that like the panic porn over these kids and their rhetoric and the extreme rhetoric and the anti-Semitism, all that's real. Like all that's real. I think there's a legitimate concern about anti-Semitism. We get into that a little bit in this focus group. There's a Jewish kid that's very far left that kind of talks about this in a very nuanced way, I think, in this group. But it's real. And I think that there's legitimate concerns and criticisms about the leadership of some of these activist groups in these protests. But like, there's this broader concern that like that's trickling down to everybody. And that we're not really seeing. Like, it's a much more passive, there's a passive directional anger towards Israel and distaste of Israel that I don't really like, and it's worth digging into. But like, a lot of it is just more, from somebody that's a casual consumer of this sort of stuff, and they're in a world where everybody is criticizing Israel and saying it's a genocide, and on their TikTok they're seeing these terrible videos, and they're like, yeah, this seems bad. And like, that is fine. Like, that's a totally appropriate response, I think. And that to me seems to be more of the median response to this than some of the gross stuff we see on X.
Yeah, agreed. All right, but before we get into that, because there's a lot on that.
Yeah.
Like I said, these guys started college in the fall of 2020, which meant that they were either fully remote because of COVID or they had all kinds of restrictions on their social lives on campus. So let's listen to how the pandemic affected the college careers of these young progressive voters.
Going online and staying home, I became really toxic because I wasn't able to really go outside and like be able to like do my hobbies that I do now. And because I'm pretty extroverted, I love being able to talk to people and everything. Like, COVID kind of just made me depressed. Like, I can't even like go outside. My parents are scared that I might like get COVID or like something will happen to me. I'd say now that it's been like way better, especially because I used to go to community college when I was back at home. But now since I'm like back in San Diego at school, I'm like independent. I'm able to have a lot more freedom, be able to like choose what I want to do with my life.
I actually started college in 2021. So it was in person for most of it. But I feel like the time that I had to spend in quarantine, like my senior year, definitely, I think, made me regress a bit in terms of like how comfortable I was with socializing, especially with new people. So like going into college that first year, like I kind of was like a hermit, and I slowly had to like unlearn my hermit-ness throughout college.
It was like a group of people that I would try to hang out with virtually because I wasn't in Austin. I couldn't really do anything there. And then the friends that I did have who were still in my hometown, we would do like socially distanced hangouts because I have immunocompromised family members. But ever since then, I feel like I actually tried harder to be extroverted. Like, I kind of pushed myself a bit to talk to people in classes that were just sitting by me because I feel like I missed out on a year of social development, networking, making friends, that sort of thing.
I didn't really start going out, making friends, and being social until my sophomore year. So my whole freshman year was just being on campus, trying to get away from home. I will say my work ethic and study mindset really kind of diminished. And after the pandemic, it just felt like, especially when classes were online, it's so much harder, at least for me personally, to learn online because especially in college, it's like PowerPoints and information and you're teaching it to yourself. And it got me to the mindset for C's get degrees when I used to shoot for the dean's list.
In my freshman year, I did live on campus because I had to have in-person labs. They wouldn't let me do remote. So I lived on campus and it was just like a dead city. It was just really isolating. And then my sophomore year was like a freshman year redo, like what I wish my freshman year was. So I felt like the past 2 years I've been making up lost time, like socially, joining clubs, meeting people. Someone said networking too. That's a big one too, like trying to form relationships with professors to get like rec letters and things like that. So it felt like I've been playing catch up for the past like 3 years.
3 weeks after like sorority recruitment ended, there was a wide like COVID outbreak. And I go to a small school, so like big COVID outbreaks very relative. So then they sent all the sophomores, juniors, and seniors home, and it was just freshmen on campus, and everyone had to move out of their freshman roommate. So everyone was just in like single dorms. And then springtime came and they only brought back the sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So freshmen were remote in the spring. And honestly, at that point, I wanted to transfer. My mom told me to give it another semester, so I did, and I ended up liking it after going through recruitment and meeting like a bunch of new people.
That's rough. Like, you're right. I mean, it is relative to, it's not like they're getting shipped off, to go fight in a war or something. But it's certainly, in terms of the life experiences you're trying to have, it does feel like they were really robbed of something. And it made me wonder, this generation gets cast both by the popular narrative and by the data. Like it's not real, as uniquely depressed and anxious. And there was certainly some of that in there, the way that their language sort of belies some of that. Do you think it's possible that the pandemic actually made, their formative experiences, being sort of forged in the pandemic, that maybe some of these kids are actually more resilient and intentional about their lives? Because they did seem like they rolled with it, and like they were really happy now and thriving.
And maybe, hopefully. Humans need human contact. This is like a fundamental belief that I have always had. Same. That is just in the past few years, I've become like, almost religious about it. Like humans need community and in-person human contact. Screens don't count. And otherwise your brain starts to do weird things. You get in your head and you start to think about things and you think too much. And sometimes you can think too much about things that are, and you imagine anxieties and stuff that aren't real. And this is everybody, not just the kids. So, but I think you're particularly susceptible to this when you're a teen. So yeah, I think that was bad. I think that they've all overcome that. There was the kind of relief of the post-pandemic element, and they were on campus in an environment where they're around other people, and so that's good. And I just struggle with the. We're trying to get some social scientists on the Bulwark podcast to kind of discuss this, because I struggle with the question of that higher depression element of it, because like. So is some of it just the language? Like people have more words now to describe their feelings than they did in 1965 or 1985 for that matter. And so are people actually more depressed, or are they just more able to describe, psychological feelings that and psychological conditions even that people have had before? And I'm not sure. I'm undecided on that question.
Have you tried to have Height on?
Yeah. Working on it.
Okay, because I think he'd be good. I'm about to read his book. I think that people are always asking me like, what happened to our politics, or what happened to the Republican Party? And down in there is always some of what happened with social media starting around 2012, 2014. Yeah. And I do think that there's just something to be said for the fact that, if you lived in a neighborhood pre-internet, like, everyone in your neighborhood kind of had the same stuff, like the same size house and the same, kinds of, like, you just didn't constantly think somebody else had more and better. And I do think social media opened up a way for people to compare themselves. I think this is especially true of young people, but it's true of everybody. And so people started to think like, well, maybe my life's not that good, or look at this other life that's so much better. And like, somebody always has a bigger yacht. Like literally everybody can look around and see somebody else who's got more. And so
I have a political feeling about this too, which is like, you weren't supposed to know everybody's fucking craziest of political opinions, and that does make you upset when it's in your face and you're like, oh wait, I thought this person was a good person, and actually they hate trans people, or they hate whatever, they hate immigrants, or they, hate Christians, and like, and people are more free to talk about that stuff on the internet, and then everyone else is reading it, and it's like the type of person who never would have known their views before. There was like a soft relationship. Now you hate them. I do think that has had an impact.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so while the encampment story's been ebbing from the news with college kids going home for the summer, good for you guys. Go home, party, have a good summer. Just
smoke weed.
Take a break.
Gummies.
Take a break.
Gummies. It's summer. Do a little summer job, Then when you go on a smoke break, get a little high on the smoke break. Like this is what you're supposed to do in the summer when you're 18.
I mean, I don't think everybody should take their life advice from Tim, but I do think you guys should chill out. I think it's good to send these kids home for the summer. But we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss how these kids talked about the encampments on their campuses. Let's listen.
At UT Austin, it was more of a chill, like sit-in on this lawn we have in the middle of campus.
Totally chill.
We didn't really have like the tents going up. People were trying to put up tents, and then the school called in like state troopers to come and remove them, and they just started like dragging students out of the crowd and arresting them, even though none of the students were doing anything violent. It got pretty bad. Like it got to the point where DPS officers were like drawing their batons on students and pepper spraying us. So it got out of hand really fast. I'm honestly like really disappointed in how the university administration handled it. We weren't trying to occupy buildings or anything. It was just like a show of solidarity and a peaceful protest, and it was met with a really irrational level of violence from the state.
And it was tarps all over and people laying in the grass for basically the whole day, and police were not really sent during the day. And then at night, most people left, but there were still probably 75-ish people from what I recall reading and seeing from my friends who were there at the encampment, and a couple people had set up tents. And late at night, around maybe 11 p.m., midnight, cops started coming in and arresting people. And from what I know and saw, again, I wasn't there, there was no like Columbia-style occupation of any building. I feel like most people, the majority of people, at least on either side, are in support of the least amount of suffering and death for the most amount of people. But the loudest voices, the ones that you'll see on the news, are the ones that are beyond that. I've seen videos of, Jewish students, me, myself being one of them, being denied to walk across the line of the protest because they're Jewish. I'm in support generally of the protests, but like the whole stand of this is like you could be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. But the people who I feel like are the loudest and who get the amplification maybe have that line blurred.
It's just very interesting that to get attention on a quite literal genocide, that this is the measures that we've had to take. And like, this is the measures that our generation is taking. I know like one thing I was thinking about heavily today was, I don't know about a lot of you guys, but most of us, the 2020 high school babies, we didn't get a graduation. And a lot of schools now are canceling graduations. And I feel like that is a tactic to punish the people who are protesting, not out of safety or concerns whatsoever. I hope that everyone who has been protesting gets the sleep and the rest that they deserve.
So the second to last kid, you'd mentioned him before. He was a very articulate kid, and he was a Jewish kid who had spent time.
Very articulate young man.
He was an articulate young man.
Tapping him on the head.
He was. I thought he was very. I do this though. I get like attached to people in the focus groups. I like find some and I think like I would just always appreciate people who are really good at expressing what it is that they feel, and I thought he did an excellent job throughout the entire group. Learned a lot from him. And so, he was the one who I really felt like was trying to tease apart what was happening on these campuses. Because what struck me about these kids was that they felt like everybody was doing the right thing on their campus for the most part. Like their campus was handling things the right way, except for that one person from UT Austin. But they looked at other campuses, specifically Columbia, and weren't sure that they were doing it correctly. But every single one of them sort of felt solidarity with the Palestinians, but felt like they were protesting the right way by being peaceful.
Yeah, I mean, I think this group was interesting because I did an interview with Rokana last week, and he had done not a focus group, but like a discussion group on Wisconsin's campus, with people that had very strong views, right? Like it included a young woman who had a cousin or something that had been killed, and then a young Jewish guy that had family members that had been and so it was fraught, it was intense. But like in that discussion and this, that was a much more intense one, the one that Roe hosted. But this one, but in both of them, like people had very reasonable views about all of this stuff. Like it was not, it's not as, sometimes you're doing these focus groups and we don't want to make fun of the MAGA people, but they start talking and you're like, oh my God, like you're like, that is an insane, like you have an insane position on vaccines or on, on the election. That was not happening in these groups, these young progressive kids. I mean, some of them, again, didn't seem maybe fully informed about everything, or like, we're still working through it, but they seemed self-aware of the fact that they weren't fully informed about, everything, and that they were kind of directionally supportive of the Palestinians and directionally concerned about the death. But like, they weren't, doing like rabid anti-Jewish talk or even really rabid anti-Israel talk so much as an expression of solidarity, with vulnerable people. So at that level, I found, it to be pretty refreshing. I have a little bit more concerns about when we get into the political conversation than I do about the Gaza. And the Gaza conversation seemed quite nuanced, and and maybe you would like for there to be, like in all of these conversations, I get frustrated with young people, like a little bit more anger at Hamas, right? Or like, there's things that you could say that I was like, ooh, I wish there was somebody in the group that was like expressing this counter view. Like it was a pretty lefty group, but it was all, I think, it was not an extremist conversation and I didn't feel like.
Yeah, I mean, look, the way that a lot of them talked about it was just like, we don't want people to die. We don't want people to starve. And I think that, I also would have liked maybe a little more like, hey, we saw what happened and that was awful, but like, this doesn't feel proportional or whatever. The way that they talk about it, it didn't even get mentioned. Like it just didn't even get mentioned.
10-7, that is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. 10-7 never got mentioned. And also the hostages that Hamas is still holding or what Hamas is doing, none of that ever got mentioned. And I think that is probably the biggest problem with what's happening on the college campuses, is that there's not perhaps a full airing of like what's happening, but like their hearts are not in the wrong place.
Right.
These kids, right? Their hearts are just kind of like, boy, we don't want people to starve and die. And I think, and I didn't hear a single person come anywhere close to expressing sort of hatred or anything in all of it. And that was sort of the point that I liked that kid was making, was he's like, I feel like it gets amplified when somebody does do that. And like, I know that it exists. I know it's happening somewhere, but like, I don't think that that's indicative of what is happening most places. And I think that's probably right. Like we are just awash. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I forget if it was in that clip you just played, but he even said like, yeah, there has been some anti-Semitism at the campuses. And then there were some other people in the group that started nodding, right? Some of the women in the group started like nodding and saying, yeah, that has been a problem. It's like he specifically said there's been, some inappropriate anti-Semitism, and there was not any even pushback. There wasn't any pushback to that within the group.
So I thought it was really interesting how the young progressives in that last set talked about how they thought the protesters on their campuses were doing things the right way, but they thought that things might have gotten a little out of hand at Columbia. Let's listen to how they thought about things at Columbia and where they draw the line on which protests are acceptable.
It's been a really tough question for me because, like, it's hard to argue that the school doesn't have the authority to stop that, whereas it's easier to argue that the school shouldn't send in the police to undeniably peaceful protest on a public lawn. It's harder to argue that when you're sitting in a building that is owned by the school and paid by the school and used by the school. And that's supposed to be used for school activities for people who may be on either side of this and are paying to use it. And so, of course, at the end of the day, if the issue is important enough, none of that should matter, because, that's the whole point of the protest, is that like none of this matters unless we address this.
I think that if it had come to a point where the protests were disrupting school activities, then it would be reasonable for law enforcement to intervene and try to keep it just as nonviolent as possible, because again, like the students were unarmed, they weren't like resisting. I don't think it's ever justified to use violence like for police violence. Like I just don't think that's ever justified. I don't really care what's going on, but I do think if there were laws being broken, they're going to have the consequences. But what's happening in Colombia is just extreme.
So not a lot of sympathy for sort of the way that, kids occupying buildings and things like that. So, mostly good.
Downright reasonable.
Downright reasonable. But, well, let me ask you this, because as we talk about reasonable, we're going to turn to the politics part of it in just a second. But just
politics
quickly,
had me twirling my hair a little bit.
As we make that turn, specifically in terms of Biden and the way that the campus protests, because it has really dominated the news. I mean, in a way that I find we talked about this at the live show, the way that so many people who are in elite media and elite institutions all went to these other elite institutions. So they're basically obsessed with what's happening on them. And so there's just so much coverage of it, which I think ends up being wildly disproportionate to its relevance. But it ends up being a situation where there's lots of people who are like, why isn't Biden doing something about the campus protests? And this is just one of those where I'm like, does Biden need to step in for campus protests all the time? I mean, I guess to the extent that like it hit a crescendo in the media, he basically had to do something, and eventually he did. But what do you think the right posture is for Biden with these sort of campus protests?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the Biden speech at the Holocaust Museum was very good, or I guess it was on Holocaust Remembrance Day. I was with the Holocaust Museum. I don't think it was at the Holocaust Museum. But I thought his rhetoric there, just clearly denouncing the anti-Semitism, was good and useful and needed. He doesn't get a lot of credit for it, but I'm glad he did it. The thing that Biden's biggest challenge is, engaging the gettable progressives. And that's what we get into in this group, right? Like he has to make a case about the choice and the importance of supporting him to people that are not super highly engaged politically, but to people that are softly engaged politically, that are getting their news on social media like these kids are. They got to figure out a way to get to them, and whether it's on abortion or whether it's on scaring Trump or whether it's on reminding them of what he did on some progressive issues. I do think there needs to be a more forceful effort to do that. I don't think that like waiting around at Columbia on the quad or GW on the quad like really serves that purpose in any meaningful way. But he does have to speak to them, because that's the group that matters here, right? Like the super engaged, super political people are mostly with them, and the ones that aren't probably aren't coming around. The people that have Genocide Joe signs on up probably aren't gettable. So like having a dialogue with them is something that you want out of the movie, the show, The Newsroom, but like isn't real, right? Like that's not helpful. Like those people are chanting "fuck Joe Biden" at these campus protests. So he's got to figure out how to get to the people in this group who are progressive, who are sympathetic to the protests, but who are not like activists.
Yeah, because they all use the word genocide, but none of them accused Joe Biden of genocide in this group.
Yeah, I don't know. Did they all use it? It was certainly used.
They didn't all use it. Several people used it, but but nobody said used. Joe Biden is committing the genocide.
Yeah, exactly. It was certainly used, and they were certainly not everybody in the group, but I would say about half the group, at least, maybe even a little more than half, clearly self-identified as being, I'm more progressive than Joe Biden. I'm more progressive than even the Democratic Party writ large. But they weren't like, they didn't know Cornell. We'll get into all this, but like they were not far left progressive activists. And so like that is a group that Joe Biden needs to vote to come home for him in the end, at least in the swing states. And so it's finding a way to speak to them. And so that's why I think this group is particularly important, because they're representative of the people that Joe Biden does need to get, which is not the people that are on your social media with the river to the sea signs.
But these kids are clearly the majority of kids on college campuses. Yeah, like that's what struck me. Like
they're the big middle, at least. I don't know. Are they the majority? Right. Like they're like the middle of the bell curve on campus, though.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. I want to get into how this group talked about their choice for president. A lot of people in the group were from non-swing states. They registered some real Kennedy curiosity. So in the spring of 2024, Harvard Youth Poll, Trump and Biden were tied at 26% apiece among voters 18 to 24, with Kennedy pulling in 10%. We just had a new poll that came out, the Siena New York Times poll that had everyone freaking out this weekend. Also had some weird youth numbers. It just really shows Trump performing better with young people than seems possible or plausible, but maybe. So it was clear, though, that this group was thoroughly unenthusiastic about Joe Biden, even though half to like a slight majority were going to vote for him. But let's listen to the Kennedy curious folks in the group.
Robert F. Kennedy is running as an independent, I think. I saw one of his campaigns on TikTok and was intrigued by it. It's talking about like student loans, women's rights, rights for abortion. So that kind of caught my attention in that way. But I kind of have to look into it more before I choose who I'm going to vote for.
I also thought it was interesting that he's like one of the first candidates that I've seen make an ad completely in Spanish and like targeted towards that demographic, which I think is really interesting. Now, again, I don't agree with everything he does or is, and especially because he's like anti-vax activist, but I do have to look into other candidates and their policies. But yeah.
Obviously, we all saw the Super Bowl ad. So that was my real first introduction to it. I've seen videos on my social media promoting whatnot. I don't know if I necessarily agree with what he stands for policy-wise, as opposed to like what the Democratic Party stands for as a whole. However, because I live in New York and I'm confident that it will go blue anyways, I might just as a show of expression vote for a third-party candidate. I think that the two-party system needs to be shaken up a little bit.
I don't know if I would say I was surprised by the role that TikTok played in shaping perceptions of Kennedy, but a lot of people talked about TikTok and how much Kennedy content there was on TikTok. Do you think that's part of his sort of Rorschach quality? Because when we did the Kennedy groups, that was like what jumped out at me. And it jumped out is the way that he can be all things to all people because they're only hearing certain things about him. So I wonder if he's like appealing to young lefties on TikTok and then using, podcasts like Bannon and Rogan to get to the more right-leaning audiences.
Yeah, like even the contrarian, less right, like the bro podcast types.
Or even like the wellness types.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of people who have this sort of like, aren't you so worried about testosterone levels dropping in men? Those people tend to like be interested in Kennedy. But like, is that parallel universe strategy sustainable for him?
Maybe. I mean, it's certainly sustainable enough to create damage. I don't know. My biggest takeaway from this, just taking it back to the 30,000 foot level, is, and I know this intuitively, but like when you hear it, it's like a little bit of a wake up call of just how overinformed we are. I'm going to put it that way versus calling them underinformed, because like the knowledge in this group about Kennedy is like basically zero. Right? Like they know he's anti-vax and they know he did the Super Bowl ad. And like, that's like literally it. The young woman that does he's the only one that's done a Spanish ad. I mean, we were doing Spanish ads on George W. Bush's campaign 20 years ago. I'm sure that I bet Michael Dukakis did a Spanish ad. Every campaign does Spanish ads, right? And so anyway, it's a little bit of a wake-up call to me in that like, conceivably that's good news, right? That like there's room for Biden and his team to kind of fill that knowledge gap with some information, with some factoids, using the money that they have to reach these people. Now, are they able to? I think that's an open question. Like, are they able to penetrate the TikTok algorithm? I mean, did any of them mention a piece of news information they got from anywhere other than social media? I don't think I heard several people said, I saw on social media, I saw on social media, I saw on social media, I saw on TikTok, I saw on Instagram. Several people. I don't think I heard a single person say, like, I read in the New York Times, know, and so part of that's generational. Like they have to I think that there is huge potential gaps in knowledge that conceivably they could be reached with if there's an effort to do it, if there's money put behind it, if, there's the know-how, for our friend Rob Flaherty at the Biden campaign that does digital and all these folks. So anyway, that was my big takeaway from all this. The Kennedy thing, the Kennedy curiosity seemed literally just to be like, I hate these two old guys and Kennedy seems fine. Like, and all I know about him is that like, I'm a little worried about the anti-vax thing because that's really the only thing I know about him besides the fact that he's like directionally liberal and anti-establishment.
That's right. And that came through. This is where after doing the groups on Kennedy, I became increasingly convinced that Biden had less to lose ultimately than Trump, because a lot of the young, like these voters who were interested in Kennedy also were like, but I don't know that much about him and I need to get educated. And presumably as they get educated about him, they'll be like, actually, no, not for me.
A little weird.
Whereas the Trump folks were people who were like, I'm out on Trump. I don't want to vote for him again. And this guy is in my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Yeah, I listen to that up. I agree. I mean, I'm hopeful that that's true, though I worry there's no rule that all these people have to get educated about him, you know. And I think if you looked at the numbers in the Harvard poll, I don't have it in front of me, but among Black and Hispanic, there's one Black woman. Were there any Hispanics in the group? I don't think so. There's one Black young woman in the group, and among Black and Hispanic young people, he was doing really well. You know, and that should be a Biden group, right? And so, you know, that again, that has to be a concerted effort to reach those folks. This is not going to happen by osmosis. Like the viral TikToks are not Joe Biden's TikToks. The things that are being fed these people in the algorithm are, you know, it's like it's tabloid stuff. It's just digital tabloid, right? And so they're going to see the more salacious stuff, and they're going to be attracted more to the contrarian, you know, kind of RFK stuff if they're not delivered other information.
So besides RFK, though, the thing that is just replete through the groups that we do with young people. We've done a bunch now. For some reason, you're our resident young person, like
me and
talker.
Hamby.
When we have one,
I think it's because we have
That's
Peter
right.
Pan syndrome. Me and Hamby.
That might be it. But you know what? That's it. Well, going back to the beginning, where I was thinking about like why you're on for the youths. It's not even any of the USC stuff. It's just like you seem like the youngest person I know because you're so cool.
Thank you.
So cool and hip. With your pearls.
I do go to shows. And I steal my style from TikTok twinks. You know, I see something that they're doing, and then I'm like, you know, I should wear that. That looks good on that 20-year-old.
Yeah, and I steal my fashion from Subaru commercials. But the thing about these young folks, they are just out on Biden. I mean, some of them were going to vote for him, but like it's not even worth playing. But the general rating of Biden, it wasn't even about Gaza or anything. It's just the too old. It's just the too old stuff. So like, how did you find them? You had a rant, I know, on the political stuff. So just hit me.
It started with, you know, they're being asked if any of them are happy about Biden or excited about Biden. And, you know, there's not even the one contrarian that raises their hand and say, I actually like Joe Biden. It's just total crickets, nothing. But then the follow-up is like, okay, well, who would you like better? They can't name anybody. Right? It's like, I just want somebody younger, whatever, anyone younger. Someone literally said anyone. It's like, okay, well, and then it's like, well, and then the question of what about this critique that Trump and Biden are similar?
Yeah.
And you go around and they're like, well, yeah, they both are in the pocket of big corporations, and like they both are part of the establishment. And, you know, it is true that like, you know, politicians, no matter who was in there, you know, they were going to side with Israel at a certain level. And so it doesn't, like, we really want an outsider. In some ways, this is where they sound a little bit like the MAGA groups. Like, I really just want somebody outside of the system, you know, somebody that's not. And it's just like, I mean, that was like a fair critique when we were in college of like Bush and Gore.
Gore. That was like the dominant narrative about Bush and Gore.
And it turned out to be wrong then, though. That's the one thing. Like, it turned out to be so wrong. Like, right? I mean, Gore probably doesn't take into Iraq, but Iraq isn't an issue then, right? Because this is the whole thing about picking candidates so frustrating. It's like Trump is so unfit. Manifestly, we don't know what the future holds. Will there be another pandemic? Will there be another war? And you have this insane person in charge. Like in 2000, when Bush was running as a compassionate conservative and Gore was running as like a DLC Democrat, it seemed like they were very similar. Turned out, like, you know, terrorists attack the World Trade Center, and all of a sudden they don't seem so similar because of who the people, also not even so much about Bush and Gore, but who they put in. Gore wouldn't have had Donald Rumsfeld, you know, running his Defense Department, just like, you know, Biden won't have Michael Flynn or whoever the hell, you know, Trump brings back in for the second round. So anyway, that rant is over, but like they just don't see it. And like there were one or two people that expressed that they're personally very different, you know, even if they're similar policies, which like just isn't true. And then when you like listen to them more talk about the things they don't like about Biden, again, it's not like they have this view of, well, I'm aware of the student loan thing and the chips and the climate investment and infrastructure. I just don't think that was that big of a deal. You know, like they don't like none of that. None of the good Biden stuff comes up at all. Right. And,
at all.
And the negative stuff is all like, well, he's not for Medicare for all. And it's like, okay. I mean, Medicare for all isn't going to happen. It's very frustrating. And then they ask who are you going to vote for? And it's like half raise their hand for Biden and then half are still thinking about it. And in the end, when a forced pushed vote of Trump Biden, they all said Biden. Right. And so this is the lesson of the group, right?
Yes.
It's just like by Halloween, it's got to be a forced choice vote of Trump and Biden, chicken or fish. That's it. Like those are the options. Like there isn't anybody else.
Chicken or excrement.
Yeah, chicken or excrement, and hopefully they come home to the chicken. But it was frustrating. I mean, God love them all. They all were well intentioned. They all were sweet, but like it does not feel like there's any deep thinking. And this is part about coming up in the Trump years, I think, right? Like Trump is normal for them in a way.
This is always my big takeaway when I listen to young people is just how much they don't talk about Trump like he's an aberration of the Republican Party. Like when you talk to older Republicans, they very much understand or older Democrats. Like older Democrats oftentimes, now I don't know how true this is, but they certainly retcon the idea that like, remember when Republicans were normal and they were good. And even if I didn't want to vote for them, they were still good people. And they, they're very sort of fond of the old Bush, McCain, Romney days.
I think Bush's approval right now is higher among Democrats and like Gallup than among
makes
Republicans.
Total sense. Yeah, makes total sense. But the idea of how much for young people, Trump is just all they've ever known of politics. And so Nikki Haley is more anathema to the idea of what Republicans are for a young person than Trump is, because Trump is all they've ever known.
Yeah, and also Nikki Haley's kind of just Joe Biden to them too. Also, like it's just all the same. I mean, like the issue set. Like there's something about, I think, so we were a little bit before, but like the folks that are a little bit younger than us, like if your formative time was in the post 9/11 era, right? And you have Obama and Bush and McCain and Romney. It's like very simple, like, right? It's like, oh wait, this guy was against these stupid wars and they were for, right? Like there was like a very clear issue delineation for young lefties, right? And like that just doesn't feel like it's there for Biden and Trump. Like they're like, yeah, Trump is crazy, but like I don't know. I don't know how we could make immigration maybe have the same moral valence for these young folks that Gaza does. Does that help motivate them? Are there other stuff? Race? It feels like maybe for a moment there during George Floyd that was kind of there, but Joe Biden was never really an avatar of police reform. I don't. There just isn't an issue. There isn't a clear issue for them, even though there's so many if you listed them. But there's not one clear for defining issue.
They have to make an abortion, right?
Yeah.
And I do think, and in the young group, which does not happen that often in the older groups, in the young groups, people were bringing up reproductive rights kind of on their own, whereas with the older groups, you often have to kind of tease that out. It doesn't come up naturally.
But it also is kind of like in a list. It's like, well, there's climate and Medicare for all and reproductive rights, and nobody's representing that, right? Versus
that's
like,
totally true.
There's a clear Biden is on my side on this versus Trump.
But this is where, too, for like our friend JVL, who says like the economy's great, what did they all talk about out of the gate? They all talked about the cost of living. They all talked about the cost of rent. Like everybody brought that up as this hurdle. And, you remember that age, but they just feel totally priced out. And I was thinking about where they were living. And I was like, I moved to Delaware right after school, but I do think a lot of kids move to cities after college to get jobs. So they did seem like they were trying to live in San Diego and other places where the rents were high. But when you talk to young people, that is the thing that you hear from everybody. They feel totally priced out of the market in terms of living.
Yeah. I think this also goes back to the social media thing. I don't know. I think there's maybe an expectations miss, and this is maybe the old guy thing, but like, I don't know. Like, it was kind of an expectation when I was 22 that all my friends were broke and that we were like living in a bunch of apartments together. So it does feel like maybe the expectations are a little bit misaligned from reality. But yeah, I mean, that doesn't take away from the fact that really cost of living is higher, and cost of living does suck for them right now, and that is top of mind. But again, unlike some of the older groups, it's not like they're like, well, that's because we need to go back to the Trump economy. They're not. There's no Trump nostalgia, at least among these students.
Yeah, because they were in early high school,
right,
during the Trump years. All right.
I got to get my cane.
Yeah, I know. These kids, man, kids these days. All right, so I want to end with one that I just wanted to ask kind of for funsies because I was super interested, which is about the rise of AI on campuses. And so when we asked about how ChatGPT had changed their lives on campus, the stories just came pouring out. Let's listen.
I was first made aware of like ChatGPT during my econometrics class, which is like a lot of coding, and we work on one individual project the entire semester. So that's where my first introduction to it was. But Gettysburg has an honor code of basically like the teachers not proctoring the exam, so they're out of their room, and it's based on trust. They're working to revise the honor code because there have been so many violations with ChatGPT, especially, and people are just using it to like summarize this article and write me a summary. And honestly, it's been happening in a lot of my classes, especially with like reading checks and reading exams. With the exams not being proctored, it makes it very easy to use ChatGPT on the questions.
I'm in a fraternity at school. Every guy has used AI in one way or another, whether to assist, to cheat. I'm sure all of them have used it in a way that would violate the code of conduct, myself included. The assignment being like respond to your classmate's discussion post in 250 words. All those assignments that kind of feel mindless to the student anyways, where they don't feel like they're gaining anything from it. The combination of hybrid classes and assignments that don't necessarily engage you all that much with the ability to just have it done for you it's too much incentive for students to avoid. But I think it forces teachers to give assignments that are a bit more abstract or a bit less direct and force you to think more in a way that you couldn't just, find them online or input them into an AI. It needs a human to do it.
At least for my school, even if you don't use ChatGPT, like part of the grade distribution is also reliant on like one's access to other people's answers. Like I know a lot of people, they will talk to their friends about like, what did you do for the code? And some people will just send code to each other and they'll copy off each other. So I feel like some people feel pressure to also use ChatGPT because they feel like if they only self-study, then they're like doing themselves a disservice because other people have a network of people that they can cheat off of.
I hear a lot more from underclassmen at my university, at least, like using ChatGPT for assignments. I don't really hear it as much from other people, like in my graduating class. I think just because we didn't really have it like in high school the way that younger students may have. So we're not as used to using it, or like we wouldn't think to turn to it first thing. It's just interesting. It's like almost kind of a mini generational divide in like people being comfortable with using AI to help them with their work or whatever.
So I'm actually a TA, like a teaching assistant and like lab assistant for some first year bio and neuro classes. And I have seen students like submit like 97, 98% AI papers, lab reports, PowerPoint slides, text copy and pasted. Like the audacity is insane. Professors I know have had to fail students entirely because they violated the honor code.
So
Nothing makes me want to just go into the grave than hearing somebody talk about the generational divide between them at 19 and the 18-year-old who is more comfortable with AI, with using ChatGPT.
what are we gonna do? Like, considering that your moral compass isn't necessarily fully formed at 18, 19.
Oh, I thought you were saying me
20.
right now.
Yeah.
Like, I'm doing pretty good. I've been doing a lot of self-work.
You did. Yeah. But like, do you think these cheating bugs will get worked out as they, like they did for the internet or other technology? But
Yeah,
like, what are
this
we
is
going to do if
typical stuff, I think. This
you
is
think
like, they're going to
what
figure
if the
it
kids
out.
can't do anything because ChatGPT is doing all their stuff for them?
Yeah. Teachers are going to figure this out. Well, again, I think that there are two things that I'm worried about. One is just the divide. Like, there's already this huge divide between students, young people who either come from privileged backgrounds or do not come from privileged backgrounds, but are very self-motivated, highly self-motivated, interested in learning, want to learn. Like, this is the best time in the history of the world for people like that. Like, you can gain so much knowledge, specialized knowledge if you're interested in a specific topic. I just think about like me as a politics dork. Like, a 19-year-old politics dork runs circles around 19-year-old Tim. I was like the smartest person about politics in any group I was in. I could do trivia. Like, if you talk to a kid on campus now, like they run circles, like they're just because their ability to get information. Yeah. So that's good. You can use AI then to even expand on that and like learn more, help you learn more. for non-self-motivated people, for people that are not, that want to use it to as a shortcut, I worry people that don't have the skills because of their background. Boy, I do worry about that gap a lot. I worry about that way more than I worry about cheating. The other thing I worry about is just fake versus real. Figuring out what's fake and real, I think, is my biggest concern, actually. And I think that a lot of people are like, well, whatever. People will the youngs will figure that out. It's like, I don't know. The fake stuff is really good. Is already good, and it's going to get really, really, really good. I worry about that a lot more.
I used to go. Do you remember Spark Notes?
Of course,
when those things came out,
Mm-hmm.
they like summarized a book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess kids have always been kids, right? Like, I read when there was a book I was interested in reading. I always read it,
right?
But like Moby Dick, did I want to read Moby Dick? I didn't.
White Whale, you get it.
I got it. Call me Ishmael. I got enough to get by culturally on that one. Spark Notes did just fine. Sorry, Professor of English. Tim Miller, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks to all of you for listening to another episode of the Focus Group Podcast. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, and check us out on YouTube. We will see you next week.
Peace.